heart stops beating.
That's me! Baldur's Gate 3 has achieved exactly what so many people want out of a role-playing game. I think a great way to describe Baldur's Gate 3 would be to say that it's Dungeons & Dragons the video game. I mean, it is based in the same universe. The game is very much tailored to how you want to play it. You can have sex with whoever you want. You can tell people to kill themselves and they'll actually do it. There's no way this works, right?
I see now. Soothe me.
You can accidentally kill off incredibly important characters by choosing the wrong dialogue option and failing stat checks. Oh my god!
No! I'm slipping away! I'll perish in here!
No!
I'll perish.
It's probably important too. Wow, I feel terrible. You can deceive people to get an edge in combat or save the ones that you love. Or you can do what I did and rush into entire armies with your party of 4 people. Firstly, I should say this is a turn-based RPG, and I know that's immediately a turn-off for some people out there. However, I'd say that the combat system in this game allows you to roleplay as whatever character you'd like to be. Story maybe doesn't reach the heights that some other games out there have. However, the story is tailored to how you play the game, allowing for so much different variety between different people's playthroughs. And you can do all of this alongside your friends if you'd like to. Couch co-op when it eventually does port to consoles, or online. However, I do think that the game is a bit more enjoyable solo, but I'll explain that later. Before you're able to experience any of this, you're given the choice to either create your character or choose an origin character or already pre-made character, alongside determining your stats, your background, your class, everything that you'd expect out of an RPG, and then add some for Baldur's Gate 3. You're able to choose one of 11 different races with 31 different sub-races to make sure that you have a character that truly does fit you. You're also able to choose one of the 12 classes or be able to multi-class and stitch together different classes alongside having the option to choose what race and what background you want to play as. You could also just pick an origin character or the pre-made characters that are in the game. Still, you very much have choice in terms of how you want their stats to look, what perks and abilities and spells that you get whilst you're leveling up. Even if your character does have a predetermined background based off of these origin characters, you're able to turn that character and twist them into whatever you want them to be. Not only do you level up to get different improvements with how you approach the world in terms of the different spells or abilities you're able to acquire or feats that you're able to acquire, but you're also able to get gear from different shops, quests, dungeons, boss fights, whatever it may be, and you're able to mix and match this different gear to approach combat in very, very different ways depending on how you approach combat itself. You can experiment with gear that makes you a literal walking cannon, or you can experiment with gear that allows you to completely avoid conflict itself by allowing you to tell people to kill themselves, or by allowing you to slip between characters thanks to being super charming. All of these character choices that you make during the character creation impact the world, which is something that like everybody wants when you play an RPG, but you rarely find. Alongside your character building and how all of that determines the world around you and the dialogue options and how different characters interact with you, the way that you approach combat itself very much determines how the world interacts with you. Baldur's Gate 3 is the first turn-based RPG I've played outside of Pokemon and Final Fantasy. I was never super against turn-based RPGs. It's more so that there wasn't really one to force me to step out of what I was familiar with. Baldur's Gate 3 was the game that forced me to step outside of my comfort zone, and I'm very, very glad I did. However, I do have to say, it doesn't mean that I prefer turn-based combat over like action combat, and I don't think it was necessarily the highlight of the game. I love the action combat in Dark Souls, God of War, Monster Hunter. However, I do think there's a point to be made that action combat doesn't really make a lot of sense in the game that's very, very, very much about you having freedom over how you want your character to interact with the world. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have combat that's adjacent to like God of War or a From Software game, or like even Dragon Age when you want to be a rogue and avoid as much combat as possible and just sneak around and steal people's stuff and disarm people. It doesn't make a lot of sense to go in there and smack them with weapons regardless of if you're able to go invisible or not. And I think that's the primary reason that I'm not super, or I should say that I'm glad that this game does have turn-based combat when the game is very much saying out for it to be an experience tailored to how you want to interact with it or how you want to roleplay. You can have up to 3 companions at any given time, and these different companions have different classes that you're also able to build in different ways, and this allows you to like pretty much be able to experience 4 different classes at one different time as you're controlling each of these individual companions yourself and how they approach combat. You can choose to have 3 of your party members attack the enemy head on, whilst you have 1 guy sneak around the edge and disarm every single enemy from the shadows. I had somebody tell me that they were able to throw grease on the floor in the room, throw fire on the floor, or shoot fire onto the floor in the room the enemies were in, and then lock the door so that they weren't able to escape. Able to have an artillery of magic users sit in the back whilst raining down havoc on the enemies, and also maybe accidentally rain down havoc on yourselves. Or you're able to do what I did, which was pretty basic, and have a traditional RPG group. There was a tank, there was a healer, and I had 2 damage users, 1 being myself. The combat itself has lots of environmental and positioning factors to elevate what otherwise may be maybe not the most crazy combat system, if that makes sense. But maybe it's wrong to call it like simple because of the amount of different ways that you're able to approach the different situations, and how your different abilities synergize and characters synergize. If you don't like turn-based games or don't really care about strategizing how you're going to approach different situations, this game might just straight up not really be for you unless you want to be a charismatic character that's able to avoid most combat scenarios. I found myself being quite frustrated with the combat multiple times throughout my playthrough, as I am not the most patient person and not the most thoughtful person and not very strategic. However, I'm sure if you really like turn-based games and you have a pretty strategic mind and are a lot smarter than me, maybe this combat is like super compelling to you. The combat was very much not the like pinnacle of the game for me necessarily. Again, it's the choices and are the pinnacle of the game, and the role play part. However, during the latter stages of the game, which is where my characters got very powerful, it was incredibly fun to walk around as like the chosen one dude and just like blow up people with lightning. Another thing, as everything is tailored to you. Another thing where the choices are tailored to you or the world is tailored to you, is the story. The story in Baldur's Gate 3 is it's all right. It's nothing that you wouldn't expect out of a fantasy RPG game. You're the chosen one. There's bad guys. The bad guys don't have a lot of nuance to them for the most part. Some of them do. Your characters have nuance to them if you choose for them to change or do things depending on what you deem is right in your story. I don't think the story is like incredibly compelling outside of the super deep, rich world that the game is set in. However, because the world is seeped with lore, and because there's so much interesting content in this universe, it really bolsters the story experiences and makes you want to search out different narrative threads, alongside you having impact in the different story beats determined by how you approach combat. Who did you kill? Who did you determine not to kill? Who did you call ugly? That sort of stuff. There are gods and demons and devils and planes and dragons and portals, and it's fantasy and it's fun for people who like that sort of stuff. But more importantly, it's a role-playing game. And one of the most iconic role-playing games of all time is Dungeons & Dragons. And a huge appeal of Dungeons & Dragons, for me, or maybe for other people out there, is the ability to roleplay with your friends. In Baldur's Gate 3, you're able to roleplay or play this game with your friends. You're able to substitute different party members or companions out for friends if you want them to drop in and drop out alongside the playthrough that you already have run. Or you're able to create all new characters with your friends. You can have 4 different completely unique characters in this party and explore the world and defeat bosses and go and delve into dungeons with friends. And that's fun and it's great. And I'm super glad it's there. And people who like a sense of community or who like to play games with their friends are probably super elated by that statement. And that's enough for them to be encouraged to buy Baldur's Gate 3 and have a playthrough with friends. However, I will say only one person's able to interact with characters and dialogue, whilst other people are forced to spectate. You also aren't able to control all 4 of the party members, so maybe the combat would feel rather simple if you're playing with 3 other people. However, these probably are small downsides if you just care about a sense of community in the games that you play. Although it may seem like a perfect video game for many players out there because of its ability to shapeshift into whatever story or game you want, it does definitely have a general plague cloud of bugginess and awkwardness because of the different interactions and how those sometimes conflict with each other. And I'm sure coding the game was incredibly messy, and it's definitely not the most polished experience out there. But if you're willing to look past that, you might love this game. I cannot think of a game out there that does a better job at being a role-playing game. It might not be my favorite role-playing game or my favorite RPG out there. However, it very much is a role-playing game. You're allowed to be whatever you want. And that's why it's one of my favorite games to come out of 2023.